The 2024 NFL season is behind us, so now our attentions are fully turned toward the 2025 offseason and, of course, 2025 rookie evaluations. But before we dive into really specifically diving into prospect evaluations for individual players, I wanted to first make a video breaking down my prospect evaluation method, especially analytically, for the positions of the wide receiver and the running back positions, because those are the two that I really invested the most time into analytically diving into these guys. So if you're at all familiar with this channel or myself and how I break down prospects and evaluate them analytically, you've probably heard me talk about my marker system, which is really just a collection of metrics, checkboxes, or baselines that previously successful NFL players have hit that I want my prospects to also hit in college. So for this video, I'm just going to basically open up my spreadsheet and show you guys everything that I have going on here to look at these guys analytically. So we can dive over to the Excel spreadsheet that I have over here, looking at the wide receiver position. And this is just a massive spreadsheet with basically every single prospect going back to 2003. Have all of these different metrics here for them, from breakout age to yards per team pass attempt to market shares to PFF numbers, fantasy points per game, combine info, all of that kind of stuff, age, draft capital, you name it. I basically got it in here if it's an analytical number. So let's break all of this down. So essentially everything that I have in here boils down to really 3 or 4 very specific and very important columns. So we have the markers, we have the Pro Football Focus markers, adjusted markers, red flags, and then I have another column that tells me how many markers people are missing. So this one here is really where a lot of this stuff hinges on and where a lot of my evaluations hinge on for wide receiver prospects. That's basically how I've been doing it for the past few years. Analytically, of course, I do watch film on these guys. Maybe not as much as I probably should, but I do watch film. But a lot of my evaluations do come from the analytical side because I do believe that it is the most effective way to quickly break down an entire draft class's worth of people rather than watch, 30 or 40 different guys and sit there and watch tape. I can also just do a lot of stuff very quickly analytically because I think it's efficient. And it's also what I am personally good at. So if you're good at watching film, then that's fantastic for you. I feel like I'm good at the analytical stuff. So the marker column here, like I said, is a compilation of 14 markers at the wide receiver position of baselines that previously successful NFL wide receivers had coming out of college. So that's what I want my prospects to have coming out of college because that's what worked for them. For previously successful NFL players, that's what I want my prospects to also have. So like I said, 14 total markers. So we can go down through each one of these 14 markers. Real quickly, the two easiest ones are age and draft capital. Age, I want you to be under the age of 22 years old at the time of the NFL draft. So I think I have mathematically in here in Excel, it's April 31st. So if you are under the age of 22 by the end of April, you get a point or you get a marker. That's 1 out of 14. Draft capital, you need to be drafted in rounds 1 or 2 to then get another one because draft capital is really the most important indicator of NFL success. Obviously with first round wide receivers being the highest success rate and basically going on down all the way through undrafted. So if you're drafted in the first or the second round, you get a marker. Moving on down through here, breakout age is next, which I've actually kind of upgraded. I am now on team breakout year or breakout season instead of breakout age. But to explain this metric, breakout age, of course, is the first or the youngest age in which you eclipse a 20% or a 30% dominator rating. What is dominator rating? Dominator rating is a average of your market share of yards and your market share of touchdowns. So it's basically a one singular number that basically tells you the percentage of your team's offense that you were for a specific season. So for example, if you had a 25% market share of yards, 25% market share of touchdowns, then you had a 25% dominator rating. Those are receiving, of course. And it's an average. So if you had 20% of your team's receiving yards and you had 30% of your team's receiving touchdown, average those two together, that is 25% dominator rating. So the two thresholds that I'm looking at is 20% dominator and 30% dominator. 20% is really the first baseline to where we start to really see NFL success, where that one number starts to be important to predict NFL success is at the 20% threshold. The 30% threshold I also use because that is a much stricter and tighter baseline that really, really starts to indicate towards future NFL success. So what I used to use breakout age, where generally, if you were a freshman at 18 years old, and then you were a sophomore at 19, a junior at 20, if you broke out at a 20% threshold at 19 years old as a sophomore, then 30% as a junior at 20 years old, then that was 19 years old for 20%, 20 years old for 30%. And that's what I was using. Now, like I said, I've upgraded. I have now used breakout year or breakout season, which seems to do a better job of indicating NFL success than age. The reason being, not every single kid that comes into college as a freshman is 18 years old. So I don't want to penalize somebody for breaking out as a sophomore, but because they weren't 19 years old or 20 years old, then they wouldn't have hit my marker. So what I'm looking for is a 20% breakout season of year 1 or year 2. So if you had a 20% dominator rating as a freshman or a sophomore, you get a point. And then 30% threshold, I give them until junior year to do that. So basically, that I'm looking through years 1 through 3. Generally, the archetype is that you had a 20% breakout at 18 as a freshman, a 30% breakout as a sophomore, and then you build upon that even more as a junior. Or also typically what we see is you don't really do much as a freshman. Maybe you're even possibly redshirted, but then you have a 20% breakout age as a sophomore and then a 30% breakout as a junior. So those are basically the two very common career paths that we want to see our wide receivers kind of progress through college. Then you early declare, go into the NFL at 21 years old, and bada bing, you have a fantastic career. One perfect example of why I've switched to year specifically is you look at Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson, you can see, has a breakout age of 20 years old for both the 20% and the 30% dominators. But that was in year 2. So he broke out at 20% and 30% as a sophomore. But because he was a slightly older kid coming out of high school, his sophomore season was at the age of 20 years old. So before, when I was using breakout age, he would not have gotten a point for the 20% breakout because I wanted to see it at either ages 18 or 19. He did it at 20. But now that I'm using breakout year, that counts as a 20% breakout for him because it was as a sophomore in year 2. So we love to see that. And it's better than Chris Olave. Olave had the 20% breakout as a sophomore, 30% as a junior. Wilson did it both as a sophomore. So that's why Wilson, better prospect than Olave, better NFL player than Olave as well at this point through their career. So that's at least what we like to see. And that's why that is really the big reason why I switched from age over to season for this year and on. The other markers that I'm looking at last yards per team pass attempt and best yards per team pass attempt. Yards per team pass attempt is take your receiving yards divided by the total team's pass attempt that year. You get a number. Last yards per team pass attempt, I want to see that over 2.5. Best, I want to see that over 3. Generally, those both typically happen in the same season. Not always, but generally you see that. Anything over 2.5, like I said, is pretty good. Anything over 3 is pretty elite. Anything above like 3.5 or even above 4 is elite or even like bonkers numbers. Like Malik Neighbors, best and last yards per team pass attempt, 3.86. That is insane. Malik Neighbors, obviously, of course, phenomenal prospect, phenomenal in the NFL so far. So love to see that for both of those. Best market share of yards, I want to see that over 35%. Malik Neighbors obviously hit that too. I'm going to skip over all these PFF numbers for now. We will get to those in a minute, but they don't count towards my marker system. They don't count towards those. Fantasy points per game, best and last, I want to see both of those over 20. So you guys are very familiar with fantasy points per game. I just translate that to the collegiate level. You get over 20 points per game in your best and your final season. You get 2 points for that. Height, I want to see you at 6 foot or above. It's not a bad thing if you are not 6 foot in the NFL. We've seen a lot of really recent wide receivers come in and be under 6 foot, but generally still the most elite and most successful players at the NFL level are still at least 6 foot or above. BMI over 27, again, same thing. We've seen players be very successful in the NFL under a 27 BMI, but again, still generally the prototypical wide receiver ones have a BMI above 27. 40-yard dash, I want to see that under a 4.55. speed score, or this is weight adjusted speed score, which is typically being referenced whenever somebody just says their speed score was. That is usually using weight adjusted, not height adjusted. So weight adjusted speed score over 100, then burst score over 120. Burst score is just a standardized number of vertical and broad jump. So you basically apply a couple calculations to those, add them together. If that's over 120, you're good to go. So those are the 14 markers that I am looking for wide receivers. And of course, you may notice that Malik Neighbors hit on all 14 of them. He is one of 3 players in my database to hit on all 14, the other being DJ Moore, and then the other one being Kenny Britt. So those are the only 3 players since 2003 to be quote unquote perfect prospects in my marker database. Now, it's not to say that, I don't consider any of these players to be like perfect prospects. And it's not to say that any other players who were elite prospects, but not perfect prospects, weren't actually perfect. Like having 13 is still phenomenal. That's where Jamar Chase was. That's where AJ Brown was. That's where Amari Cooper was, where Calvin Johnson was, where Larry Fitzgerald was. Like, that's not to say that you didn't hit 14 markers, but you're Calvin Johnson. I feel like that doesn't negate what I'm trying to do here, but it also doesn't mean that, it's phenomenal. If you have 13 or more markers hit, you are an elite prospect. And spoiler alert, Tech McMillan is currently on pace to have 13 markers hit. So he'll be joining that same company that I just showed there on the screen real quick. So those are the 14 markers for wide receivers. You will notice too that some of these cells in this column for my markers are highlighted in orange, as it is here for Marvin Harrison Jr. The reason why I have it highlighted orange is because that means I'm missing combine numbers. Marvin Harrison Jr. did not test last year. He did not run his 40-yard dash or do anything else. He didn't need to. He said, I'm a top 5 pick either way, rather not risk getting hurt or losing draft stock. So he didn't run. So I don't have combine measurements for them. And theoretically, had Marvin Harrison hit all 3 of those, which I think he would have, then he would be higher on my raw marker list than not. So that's why you see some of these colored orange. The other one that I do off of the markers is this adjusted markers column here. Adjusted markers is basically one final adjustment onto the raw markers number based on draft capital. So if you are a first round draft pick, I add 3 points to your score. If you're a second round draft pick, I add 1 point. Third round doesn't do anything. I don't add or subtract. But once you hit day 3, if you're a 4th round pick, I subtract a point. 5th round pick subtracts 2. 6th round pick subtracts 3. 7th subtracts 4. Undrafted subtracts 5. So it is a draft capital adjustment where I'm heavily weighting first round draft capital, also rewarding second round draft capital, highly penalizing day 3 draft capital, because again, draft capital is our greatest indicator of NFL success for one of these numbers. So I want to further weight upon that. And that is actually the column that I have this whole entire database sorted by per draft class. So you'll notice that the top 5 names for the 2024 class in terms of adjusted markers went Malik Neighbors, Rome Odunze, BTJ, Marvin Harrison Jr., and then Xavier Legette. So I feel like that's a pretty, and Worthy was 6. So I feel like that's a pretty solid ranking of the 2024 class. And again, Marv didn't test. So had he tested and had 3 more markers, then he would have had 12 total markers. First round draft capital would have added 3 more. So he would have been at 15. He would have been the wide receiver 2 in this order. So it would have went Neighbors, Marv, Odunze, BTJ, which is basically consensus 1 through 3 in that, or 1 through 4 in that order. And then Legette and Worthy were 5 and 6. I feel like that's a pretty good ranking for the 2024 class, and it only continues that way. Like 2023 went JSN, Flowers, Quentin Johnston, ouch, Jordan Addison, then Rashee Rice. I feel like that's a pretty good ranking for the top guys in that class. Puka Nacua is down here at wide receiver 22 in the class, but we will get to him in a second in terms of being an outlier. Puka Nacua right there. We will get to him in a second, so I have some explaining to do. 2022 went Burks, ouch. Sky Moore, ouch. Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, Wandale was your top 5. London and Jameson Williams were down at 6 and 7, but again, they did not test. JMO had torn his ACL. London, I think, had an injury at that point too, so neither one of them tested. Had they actually tested, they would have been up here above Garrett Wilson. Both of them would have been above Garrett Wilson in the top 3 or 4. So ouch on Burks and Sky Moore, but I think the rest of the list in terms of London, Williams, Wilson, and Olave worked out pretty well. And Dotson was down here, wide receiver 8. Pickens. Yeah, there's other names. 2021, Chase, Bateman, Elijah Moore, Devonta Smith, Kadarius Toney. Again, Devonta Smith did not test. Had he tested, he would have been wide receiver 2. So it would have went Chase, Smith, Bateman. I feel like that's a pretty good list. Amon-Ra was even up here, still pretty well. He was a top 12 guy. So he kind of draft capital really kind of killed him, but he was still kind of up there. 2020, Lamb, Jefferson, Rager, ouch, Ayuk, Judy, Pittman. There's your top 6 for the 2020 class. I feel like that's a pretty good ranking for the 2020 class. And then 2019, N'Keal Harry, AJ Brown, Isabella, and Arcega-Whiteside. But then Metcalf and Hollywood, Paris Campbell, Deebo Samuel. I feel like that's, again, a pretty good grouping of players in terms of how they should be ranked at the top, which, again, is largely based on draft capital, but also ranked on my marker system. So I feel like just in general, my marker system does a pretty good job of highlighting who the top guys are in each class and ordering them correctly or semi-correctly in the class, that if you just looked at that, you would have pretty good success. Now, I did mention that I want to break down these PFF markers. So I have this other column here. This is new to 2025. I've been working on this for the past week or two, bringing in a bunch of Pro Football Focus metrics, yards per route run, targets per route run, first downs per route run, missed tackles, contested catches. I was not using any of that prior to this year, and I will be using it now, especially now that it's become very mainstream. And they're also very good indicators of NFL success too. So I have 16 Pro Football Focus metrics that I'm looking at. It's these. Let me see if I can get them all on one screen here. These 16 right here, 17 technically. I have total routes run in here, but that's just for my. I don't use them for the markers. That's just for my personal reference of how many routes these guys have been running. So these right here are the metrics. Like I said, yards per route run, targets per route run, first downs per route run, yards after catch per reception, contested catch rate, contested catch receiving percentage, missed tackles, and slot rate. Because generally, if you're a high slot right player in college, you usually get typecast as a slot player in the NFL, and usually slot usage does not generally equate to high elite upside NFL success for the wide receiver position. So I kind of penalize people for being highly utilized in the slot. So I have 16 of those. And again, I have baselines for all 16 of them. Basically, and I don't just make up the baselines. They are all essentially, again, looking at previously successful NFL wide receivers that have at least 2 top 24 seasons under their belt. I want them to be in the top 50th percentile on all of those markers. So that leads me to 16. And like I said, Neighbors hit on 13, Odunze hit on 10, Marv hit on 10. That is where we're at with the Pro Football Focus one. So I didn't integrate them into my marker system because then I would have had 30. Just feel like that's a little bit too much. I still really trust my personal marker system, but I'm also incorporating the PFF markers to add another layer of analytical analysis for a lot of these guys. The way that I'm going to be using this moving forward is that I generally want to see the PFF markers aligning more or less with my markers. So if they're both pretty similar, like I said, Neighbors 14 for me, 13 for PFF. Odunze 10 for me, 10 for PFF. Marv 9 or could have been up to 12 had he tested, 10 for PFF. I generally just want to see you in and around the same numbers for both of these marker systems. Where it starts to get fun is when you are so far and away better than my marker system on Pro Football Focus or so far and away worse than my marker system on Pro Football Focus. And those are the really, really fun players that we're going to be talking about here. So you can thank Ladd McConkey for a lot of this because Ladd inspired a lot of the reasons to use Pro Football Focus for me. Because if you remember, if you watched this channel last year, I was a major hater of Ladd McConkey. And the reason being was because he only hit on 5 of my markers. He did not have a breakout age. He did not average over 50 yards per game in his career. He did not have a season of over 2 yards per team pass attempt. Those are big time death sentences for any other wide receiver prospect. But I kept hearing all these other people kept saying, oh, Ladd McConkey is so good on a routes run basis. His yards per route run, his targets per route run. He separates. He does all this stuff. His route running is phenomenal. I kept hearing all of that. And I saw good tape on film for Ladd McConkey. But I kept falling back on if he was that good in college, that good route running, that good on a per route basis, that should have translated over. He should have broken out. He should have had a season over yards per team pass attempt. That's what I fell back on. And I was wrong. I was obviously very, very wrong on that. But what makes it very interesting is that I noticed that Ladd McConkey hit on over double the number of PFF markers than he hit on my markers. So, and you look at the ones that, of course, everything was right. Like he averaged over 2.5 career yards per route run. That's very good. He 12% of his routes went for a first down. He had 6.6 yards after the catch per reception. That's very, very good. He hits on that marker. He had only 12% contested catch targets. So he was only targeted 12% of his targets he was contested for, which is also a very good indicator because that usually means the other 88% he was not contested for, which usually means you're a very good separator and a very good route runner if you're not getting contested targets. But when he did get contested targets, he brought them down at a 53% clip. So that means he was winning them more often than not for the entire career when he did get those contested catches. So you love to see that. 25% missed tackles forced. Didn't do a lot of stuff out of the slot. I mean, he was used kind of more-ish as a slot receiver than some more X receivers, but only 30% career slot rate. So he was 70% of the time was out wide, essentially, which you love to see still for Ladd McConkey, who might have been typecast as like a Julian Edelman or a Danny Amendola kind of guy. Wasn't necessarily utilized like that in college. So all good things that you love to see from Pro Football Focus that I did not use last year that I am now going to use moving forward due to Ladd McConkey. And again, like I said, I noticed that he had over twice as many PFF markers hit as my markers hit. That got me thinking, wondering, is that actually going to be a thing? Is it going to be a thing that when players are that much better on Pro Football Focus on a per route basis than what I'm giving them credit for, is that a sign of a prospect being better than what I want to give them credit for? A spoiler alert is. So you'll notice I have them colored in as this blue color in the PFF column for these players that match this kind of criteria. And the criteria is pretty simple. You just have to average, or you have to have over twice as many PFF markers hit as my markers hit. You have to hit on at least 10 of these Pro Football Focus markers. So that means that generally you are that much better, like over two markers, 2 times as many PFF markers as my markers, and double-digit PFF markers. That means that both of those are very, very high signals. You also can't have any fewer than 3 of my markers hit. If you have 3 or under of my markers hit, you're just a bad prospect. Like there's there's nothing more to say about that. You are legitimately a bad prospect. You have to have at least more than 3 of my markers hit. McConkey fit that at 5. And you just had to be drafted. You can't be an undrafted free agent. You just have to be drafted. So those are the rules to get this blue color on the PFF marker. So we can run down through the names here. Ladd McConkey hit it. Javon Baker hit it. Oof. Did like Javon Baker, but it gets better. Puka Nacua hits that. Love to see that. So Puka. Scroll down a little bit more until we find another blue one. T. Higgins. Nice. Hollywood Brown. Love to see it. Deontay Johnson. Love to see it. Scroll down a little bit more. Deion Kane and then Richie James. And that's it, because PFF basically, I don't have anything for PFF like past 2016 because they didn't really track any of those numbers prior to that. So from 2019 through 2024, you're essentially hitting on a good number of guys, and you're still missing on a couple of them, but a lot of these players weren't really highly drafted players. Like McConkey might have been the highest drafted player in rookie drafts. Like he was a fringe first round guy. Wasn't even really a first round guy unless somebody really was in on that LA Chargers landing spot. And even then he could have been found in the second round in a lot of super flex drafts. So McConkey, fringe first round guy. Baker was like a fourth rounder. Puka was like a third or fourth rounder 2 years ago. T. Higgins was a second rounder, even a mid-second rounder at some point because of how good this 2020 class was. Like Lamb and Jefferson and Judy. And then you also had all the running backs. You had Jonathan Taylor and J.K. Dobbins and Cam Akers. And you had Joe Burrow and Justin Herbert. Like that from a Superflex perspective, that class was loaded. And T. Higgins fell to more of the early to even mid-second round of Superflex drafts in that rookie class. Hollywood was like a second round pick. Deontay was like a third or even a fourth potentially. And then, of course, Deion Kane was maybe like a third or a fourth. And Richie James was not drafted. So you're not really using high draft capital to take the shots on these guys that really pop out in this blue kind of coloring, So if that means that I have to take a few dart throws and miss on Deion Kane and Javon Baker to get the shot on getting Deontay or Hollywood or Higgins or Puka or Ladd McConkey, I mean, I'm doing that all day. This is something that I'm going to be looking at hard moving forward, is trying to see if I can identify more of these players that fit into this kind of blue column of just, that much better on a per route basis than what I'm giving them credit for. And I will give those players credit for that moving forward. So I feel like I think I have learned something from missing on Ladd McConkey, and I'm hoping to use it to my advantage moving forward. Because when I see something that says, hey, you could have hit on Ladd McConkey with this, and you could have hit on Puka with this, I'm paying attention to that. The other area, like I said, so that is if you are greatly better in PFF than my marker system. Now, the other side of the coin is if you are a lot worse in PFF than my marker system. So that is where this red kind of color comes in. And you'll notice the first player on this list is Brian Thomas Jr. That sucks. But it gets a lot better. Let me run through this one. So again, you have to have half as many PFF markers hit as my markers. And you had to have been drafted in the first or second round. So I'm essentially looking at who are these players that are drafted very highly in the NFL draft, thus that we are drafting very highly in rookie drafts, but they might be overvalued or they might not actually be as good of prospects because on a per route basis, they are not doing all that well. So Brian Thomas Jr. is number one on here, but then you get to Xavier Legette. Feel like that's a pretty good hit early on. Adonai Mitchell. Feel like that's a pretty good hit moving forward. Like he's effectively the wide receiver 4 in Indianapolis. Couldn't even beat out Alec Pierce. So feels like that's a hit. Jonathan Mingo is on this list. Sorry to anybody out there who drafted Jonathan Mingo. Justin and I tried to warn you, but he is on this list. Big time face planner. Tyquan Thornton is on here. Feel like most people just kind of disregarded Tyquan Thornton anyway. The only reason he got drafted in the second round is because he ran a sub 4.3, but he's on the list. He didn't do well. Terrace Marshall, also on the list. A lot of people were in on him. He did not pan out. Jalen Reagor is on this list. Big time bust. Basically the biggest pitfall in that 2020 class. You could have had many other options. And if you drafted Jalen Reagor in that class, major pitfall. He is identified by this kind of under half as many PFF markers hit as mine. Michael Pittman, he's one of the other hits on this list. There's only 3 of them. BTJ and Pittman are 2 of them. We'll get to the third one in just a minute. And then Denzel Mims, another one on this list that a lot of people went for as well in the 2020 class. He was sometimes drafted over T. Higgins. So if you made that mistake, this is showing that you should not have made that mistake. Then the big one, N'Keal Harry gets highlighted by this. And I think that is absolutely interesting. That is beyond interesting to see that N'Keal Harry gets pointed out on here. And then DK Metcalf is the other one. There's nobody else on red on here. These are the last 2. N'Keal Harry and then DK Metcalf. So of that whole entire list, you get 3 hits. You get BTJ, Michael Pittman, DK Metcalf. But had you just used this one singular indicator to fade all of these wide receivers, you would have faded N'Keal Harry. You would have faded Jalen Reagor. You would have faded Denzel Mims. You would have faded Terrace Marshall. You would have faded Jonathan Mingo. I feel like that's a pretty good indicator of players that we should fade. Of course, like I said, you would have missed out on Metcalf. You would have missed out on BTJ this past year. But just in general, I feel like that's something that we have to pay attention to. So I'm also going to be paying attention to that moving forward. And we'll see if any of these prospects in 2025 or beyond land on that same list in both ways. Positively in the blue column, negatively in the red column. We'll see how that pans out for the 2025 class. The only other column left to talk about for the wide receivers is this red flags column, which is, again, just a summation of indicators that I have found that if you lack those on your prospect profile is generally a bad thing. So this is usually if you didn't break out at all in college, under 50 receiving yards per game over your entire career, no season over 2 yards per team pass attempt, you have a sub 23 BMI, so you're just like really, really tiny and small framed, not a good indicator of success. You run a 40-yard dash slower than a 4.6. You have 3 or fewer markers hit in my marker system. That just means you're a bad prospect. And that you are 24 years old as a prospect or older. So again, any one of those things may not be super detrimental to a person's profile. Like BTJ has a red flag. Xavier Worthy has 3 of them. Ladd McConkey had 3 of them. I remember Devonta Smith had 1 because he was a 23 BMI. Didn't matter at all. I mean, he was a Heisman winner. So if it didn't matter in college, I don't think it mattered in the NFL for him to win the Heisman. So like I said, any one of those, or even any like 2 of them, are not necessarily like detrimental to a player's profile. But when you start stacking them, 3, 4, 5, 6 of those, starts to mean that you're probably not really that good of a prospect. And that doesn't really come up all that much. I just kind of use it as more of an interest thing, but it is there. And that's that. So I do have the 2025 class in here for the production markers so far. We are missing 6 markers in totality because obviously the combine hasn't happened yet. The NFL draft hasn't happened yet. So I'm missing the 5 athleticism markers and their draft capital to fill out the full entire profile for these guys. But this is what it's looking like so far for early 2025. You got Tet, you got Travis Hunter, Luther Burden, then Ricky White, Nick Nash, Torrey Horton, Jalen Royals, Alec, I don't even know how to pronounce his name, Jaden Higgins, Trey Harris. The interesting ones, if we were looking back to the PFF things, if we're on the PFF marker watch for anybody in this class, nobody is on PFF watch in the red category. So nobody so far is really going to be on pace to have drastically more markers hit in my prospect database than PFF markers hit. So that feels like a pretty good thing. But that also kind of, generally this class is not really all that good. The fact that we only have a couple people that he can even pace to be over 10 markers hit is kind of pretty bad. Tet McMillan obviously on pace for 13, so that's fantastic. But nobody is on pace to have half as many PFF markers hit as my markers hit. So that feels like a good thing. But there are a couple names that greatly outperform in PFF than compared to my marker system. Most notably is Emeka Egbuka. He only hits on 2 markers, and that's generally just because he was never the guy in Ohio State. He was always the wide receiver 2. And that, again, that is not really necessarily his fault. The fact that he played with Garrett Wilson, with Chris Olave, with Jackson Smith and Jigba, with Marvin Harrison Jr., with Jeremiah Smith, like that is not really his fault that he's played with some absolutely generational talents at Ohio State, and he just happens to not be as good as them. That is not detrimental to his prospect profile. It's just that he didn't hit on a lot of the stuff that I'm looking for. But again, when I noticed that he is so much better on a per route basis, like he averaged 2.6 yards per route run, 25% targets per route run, 12.5% first downs per route run, 6.6 yards after catch per reception. Like that sounds a lot like Ladd McConkey. So I'm going to give Emeka Egbuka credit. I didn't even hate Egbuka before this. Like I was propping him up in my own personal rankings over my marker system because Egbuka is just a good wide receiver. But it's nice to see that that is being backed up by the PFF markers also being that much higher than my markers and puts him in that Ladd McConkey, Puka Nacua, Deontay Johnson kind of class as a prospect. The other interesting name on that list could be Tez Johnson. He only hits on 1 marker which is a sophomore 20% breakout age, but he does not have a 30% breakout and did not do a whole heck of a lot of other stuff. But he does hit on 12 PFF markers. So on a per route basis, he was also pretty good. So Tej Johnson is one to note. Then the other one is, who else is that? Torrey Horton is the other one in here. He only hits on 4 markers, 13 PFF markers. So maybe he's this year's Puka or from like a smaller school from Colorado State. We'll see. But those are the 3 names to keep watch on for 2025 positively given their per route statistics from Pro Football Focus. But that's essentially it. Of course, all this will be updated after the NFL Combine and then finalized after the NFL Draft. But that is how I evaluate wide receivers from an analytical standpoint using my markers, using Pro Football Focus now, new for 2025 and beyond, how I adjust those markers, some of the pitfalls that I'm kind of looking for. That is everything that I do analytically to evaluate wide receiver prospects. All right, now we can take a look at the running back position and how I evaluate the running backs using my marker system with both my actual markers and then the new Pro Football Focus markers that I am incorporating into the 2025 and beyond analysis. And yes, different outfit, recording on a different day than wide receivers. But let's take a look at the Excel sheet for this one, for the running back position. And again, I have it laid out as looking at the 2024 class before I pull up the 2025s. But essentially, this Excel spreadsheet is basically the same thing as the wide receiver spreadsheet. It's formatted basically the same way. It's just tuned towards the running back position and not the wide receiver position. So the metrics are going to be different here. But the theory and basically the foundation is all pretty much the exact same thing. So of course, N here, column N is the important column that we're going to be looking at that compiles and sums up our total markers hit for every single prospect. And then, of course, we have the adjusted markers column. We have the PFF markers. I don't have red flags for the running back position. I've tried to work on them. I'll explain a little bit in a bit about why the running backs are different than wide receivers and evals and how things are just overall different between the positions. But like I said, marker system, still basically the exact same thing. I'm using baselines that previously successful NFL running backs had coming out of college, and I'm using that to evaluate prospects from 2024, 2025, and beyond moving forward. So I have 12 markers for the running back position. It was 10 last year. I've added 2 more this year. So the 12 markers that we have right now are age. I'm again looking for you to be under 23 years old. I've added an extra year than I did for the wide receivers. Wide receivers, it looks like you need to be under 22. For running backs, you can be 22 years old when you come out of college, so you can be, a non-early declare, so to speak. But if you're over 23 years old, generally that's not really a good sign. And especially if you're over 24, that's really not a good sign either, that you stayed in college basically for way too long. So under 23 years old, you get a marker hit. Draft capital, once again, it's either first or second round, same as the wide receivers. Nothing's really changed there. Then we start looking at some career metrics. So the first one is yards per carry. I want you to be over 6 career yards per carry. And that one is just basically, it's kind of incorporating a little bit into the breakaway runness of, just carrying the ball. If you have a higher yards per carry of over 6, that generally means you're incorporating a lot of breakaway runs or at least, 10 plus, 15 plus runs. And you are very efficient with the ball in your hands at a collegiate level. So over 6 yards per carry is the third marker. Best receptions. So that is, I want to see a single season of at least 25 receptions or more. So I'm not looking at like total receptions or anything like that. Just on a season level, if you have one season over 25 receptions, you get a marker, you hit on that point. Best total yards as a freshman or a sophomore. So essentially in your first or second season, I would like to see you having over 1,000 total yards. So rushing and receiving, add those together, over 1,000. If you do that in year 1 or year 2, you get a marker on that too. Basically just saying you were good enough coming out of high school in either year 1 or year 2 to start pushing for immediate work and basically become an immediate bell cow. Again, not necessarily the bad thing if you did not do that in year 1 or year 2, but generally the best NFL running backs were also really good in college, and they showed that very early on in their career. I don't do anything with first fantasy points per game, but I do have last season's fantasy points per game of over 20, and then best season's fantasy points per game over 25. Generally, those could coincide, but like the wide receiver position, they don't necessarily have to. As long as you have one season at least over 20, your final season over 20, and then one other season at some point in your career over 25, you will hit on both of those markers. I'm going to skip over the PFF metrics again, just like I did for wide receiver. I have them in a separate column, just like for wide receiver. So the last couple of metrics or markers that I'm looking for are all just combine / athleticism related. So I want to see your weight being over 200. Again, generally, we've seen some smaller running backs coming into the NFL having very good success, but the NFL still really does seem to value those bigger sized or more prototypically sized NFL running backs of over 200 pounds. Again, definitely not a game changer because Jahmyr Gibbs weighed 199 pounds, did not hit that marker, is totally fine. But the NFL still does kind of skew towards those bigger bodied backs of being at least 200, if 205, 210, 215. That is still the prototypical size for an NFL running back. And with that, I don't do anything for height, but I do BMI of over 30. So basically, if your BMI is over 30, that's basically saying that you are a prototypical size for an NFL running back. You hit another marker. 40-yard dash, I just want to see a sub 4.55. Weight adjusted speed score, so just speed score, I want to see that over 100. That's the same metric as wide receiver. Burst score, I want to see that over 20. Again, same metric as wide receiver. So I want to see prototypical sized body and pretty good athleticism. That's essentially what I'm looking for from the combine. I don't really care if you blow the combine out of the water or what. I just need to see you hit some baselines, and that's all this really is. So again, like the wide receivers, any one of those 12 markers is not necessarily super difficult to hit specifically as an individual point. But when you start, parlaying them essentially into 12 markers, that's again over the, when you stack them up over 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 markers, that's really where you start to see some big time differentiators between who the best running back prospects are versus guys who kind of, lack in some of the areas. So I believe over the course, this is since 2001, we only have a couple, three perfect prospects in Bijan Robinson, Travis Etienne, and Jonathan Taylor. So since 2001, so essentially for over 20 years, almost 25 years of this data, only 3 perfect 12 out of 12 prospects, and all 3 of them came in this decade, which I think is pretty interesting. But again, like the wide receiver position, it's not a bad thing to be in the double digits either. If you hit 10 or more of my markers, you're looking like a pretty good NFL running back, especially when you pair that with the draft capital. Like Jeremy McNichols down here did not get draft capital, but he had double digit. Same with Ryan Moats down in here. But you look at a lot of this list, Bijan, Brees, ETN, Javonte Williams, could have been good before the injury. JT, Cam Akers, DeAndre Swift, Saquon is in here. He hit on 10. Christian McCaffrey, Leonard Fournette, Dalvin Cook, Joe Mixon. The 2017 class was fantastic. Zeke, Derrick Henry, Todd Gurley, Mendenhall, Beast Mode, D'Angelo Williams, Reggie Bush, Steven Jackson, LaDainian Tomlinson. Like, you hit on double-digit markers in my system, chances are you're a pretty elite running back. So it still looks to be like a pretty good system. And then, of course, on top of the markers, I have the adjustment for draft capital. So it's basically the same thing as the wide receiver position. If you were drafted in the first round, I add 3 points onto your markers. Second round, I add another point. Third round, I don't think anything happens. And then when you're day 3 and on, you start losing either 1, 2, 3, or 4 points or whatever it is, depending on the round that you are drafted in. So final adjustment, which is how this is sorted. And again, just like the wide receivers, I feel like the way that these are sorted just by adjusted markers is pretty solid in and of itself. For the 2024 class, Jonathan Brooks did come out on top. Sucks to see it because of the dual ACL injury basically from 2023 and this past season. But he was the number 1 running back last year. Trey Benson, Marshawn Lloyd, Blake Corum, Ray Davis, Jalen Wright, Bucky Irving is down in here. His 1 PFF marker is highlighted as blue. We'll get to that in a second for Bucky. 2023, Bijan, Gibbs, Charbonnet, Achane. There's your top 4 with Spears and Kendre Miller bringing up 5 and 6. Feel like that's a pretty good list. 2022, Brees, Rashad White, Kenneth Walker, James Cook, Brian Robinson. That feels like a pretty solid top 5. And then 2021, ETN, Javonte, Najee, RIP, Trey Sermon, Michael Carter, Chuba Hubbard. Feels pretty good. 2020, JT, Akers, Swift, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, J.K. Dobbins, A.J. Dillon, Antonio Gibson. There's your top, 7 And then the 2017 class is absolutely bonkers. And I feel like I even nailed the order on this from the marker system. CMC led the way, and I know for a fact he was not the consensus RB1 in that class. It was generally Leonard Fournette, if not even Dalvin Cook for a lot of people. But my marker system has CMC graded out as the RB1 in the 2017 class. Feels like a pretty solid hit. But Fournette came up as RB2, then Cook, then Mixon, then Kareem Hunt. Then Alvin Kamara came in here at RB6. So I feel like just from the fact that my marker system was able to, kind of highlight Kareem Hunt as a top 5 running back in that class, Kamara as a top 6, even James Conner at RB8, and Aaron Jones down here at RB11. I feel like this 2017 class was just absolutely bonkers in general. But the fact that some of these names are getting pivoted up to the top makes me think that I have kind of something going on here that's pretty good. So I feel confident in my just raw marker system for the running backs, just as I do for the wide receiver position. Now, I do have those PFF metrics, Pro Football Focus metrics, that I am incorporating in this year, just like I did for wide receivers. Running backs, of course, is just they're different metrics. So we're looking at things like breakaway runs per attempt. So the number I think they define a breakaway as 15 plus. So the number of breakaway runs per attempt, missed tackles forced per attempt, first downs per attempt, yards after contact per attempt. I do have yards per route run and targets per route run. So I have all those metrics on a career basis and in a best season basis as well. So those are all the PFF markers that I am kind of looking at. And that summation total, again, based on baselines from previously successful NFL running backs had coming out of college, I believe that there are, how many? 12. 12 of those. So 12 regular markers, 12 PFF markers. And that's where we're at with this. What I do find interesting, though, is that like how wide receivers, where I wanted to see them generally aligned, and it was really telling if the PFF markers were drastically above my markers or drastically below my markers, and that could have been a good or a bad sign in one way or the other. I tried to find that same thing with the running back position, but I just can't. I can't find a clear association between that grouping of PFF metrics and NFL success. I looked at a lot of the running backs that had way more PFF markers than what my markers were, and a lot of them just still were not good at the NFL level. And then I looked at running backs that had drastically fewer PFF markers hit compared to my markers. And honestly, that list was actually kind of good to be on. Like Derrick Henry was on that list. Zeke Elliott was on that list. A couple of other really good running backs in recent history were on that list that have less than half as many PFF markers as my markers, yet they were still very successful at the NFL level. So I basically didn't really know what to do with all this PFF. And the reason being that I think that the PFF stuff means more for wide receivers on a per route basis than it does for running backs on a per attempt basis is just because of the differences in the natures of the positions, right? So wide receiver, there's always at least 2, if not more likely 3 wide receivers on the field at the same time. And what basically they're competing with each other for targets from the quarterback. And usually targets are a wide receiver earned skill. So if you're able to be that good on a per route basis and separate that well on a per route basis, generally that should lead to more success. That should lead to more targets, which leads to more receptions, more yards, more touchdowns, more fantasy points if you are that much better than everybody else on the field. So that's why I think the PFF markers work for wide receivers really well, because they really hone in on what they're doing on a per route basis. And that is so important at the NFL level when you're competing against 1, 2, 3 other wide receivers on your own team on the field at the same time. At running back, generally there is only one running back on the field at once, right? So you are not competing with other running backs for touches. You are just competing with other running backs for playing time. And playing time is basically determined by, how productive you are, the situation, how good of a pass blocker you are, pass catcher you are, chain mover, all that kind of stuff. So generally, I don't think that per attempt numbers from Pro Football Focus, like missed tackles forced and yards after contact and all that kind of stuff, doesn't really seem to be as translatable from the collegiate level to the NFL level in terms of real life success and then translating to fantasy football success for us, which I find to be very fascinating. But I think it's just because of the nature of the running back position in and of itself. And the reason why I think my markers do such a good job of honing in on successful running back prospects is because I'm really just looking at production. I'm just looking at basically raw production numbers. And, at wide receiver, you don't necessarily need to have amazing production, but at running back, you still kind of do. You need to show the ability in college to be a workhorse. You need to show the ability to be a somewhat capable receiving back. You need to have the ability to put up, kind of big yardage games, big yardage seasons, big yardage plays. That's where the yards per carry comes in. Best yards as a freshman or sophomore, over 1,000. That's where that comes in. You got to show the ability to be a workhorse and to beat out other running backs on your own team at a very early age in your collegiate career. And generally, more work in college translates to being more work in the NFL. Not all the time, but that's just most of the time. Most successful NFL workhorses were also workhorses at the collegiate level. Not every collegiate workhorse becomes a workhorse in the NFL, but most NFL workhorses were workhorses in college. So that is basically what I'm trying to find, and I think that that's why it works so well with just my regular markers, because I'm really just looking at production, which at the end of the day, for the running back position, is very important. And that's why, I have in here these blue highlighted ones in my markers column. Players that are highlighted as blue means that you hit on 7 of my 12 markers, which, regardless of draft capital, seems to be a pretty good indicator that you have the potential to be a better NFL workhorse in college, even if the draft capital does not necessarily follow. So that's why I was very in on Ray Davis last year. Audric Estime hit on that last year. You look at the 2023 class, you get Izzy Abanikanda, Evan Hull, and then Chase Brown was on that list. Why I was a big fan of Chase Brown coming out of college. Pierre Strong, Tyler Algier from the 2022 class. You look at 2021, Trey Sermon, Michael that's Michael Carter, kind of a hit. And then Chuba Hubbard, has now started to develop into being a very good NFL running back. Anthony McFarland, kind of a bust. Tony Pollard gets a nod on that one, even though the draft capital wasn't necessarily there. Chase Edmonds had some pretty solid years. You look at Marlon Mack. You look at Aaron Jones. Tariq Cohen is on this list. Kenneth Dixon wasn't all that great. Devontae Booker had a year or two. But it's not to say that you are going to be like an amazing gold mine find later in rookie drafts, but those are the guys that I want to try to target because they showed the production in college. And like I said, generally, if you are a productive workhorse in the NFL, you were a productive workhorse in college. So that's what I'm trying to find. And that's why a lot of those guys are some of my favorite guys to target in later rounds of rookie drafts, and why I go for so many of them, because I'll miss on a bunch of them because they might just end up being handcuffs at the end of the day. But if you have the opportunity to hit on a Chase Brown or hit on a Tony Pollard or an Aaron Jones or somebody of that caliber, that's, very, very good for your dynasty team. Now, you may have noticed that I do have a blue shading for the PFF markers column as well. And I will say one thing that I did find true for PFF was that when you look at uber successful NFL running backs, and I'm talking multiple RB1 fantasy seasons, which over the past 10 years since PFF has been tracking these numbers at the collegiate level, there's really only been about a dozen running backs that have had multiple RB1 seasons. And generally they all have about 3 or 4 or 5 over the past 10 years or so. What I found was that there wasn't really a metric that, so to speak, showed that they could be that much better at the NFL level, but there was probably about 4 of them that most of those running backs had. And the 4 that I really took note of was career breakaway runs per attempt, career yards after contact per attempt, best season of first downs per attempt, and best yards per route run per attempt. If you hit on those 4 PFF markers, those 4 baselines, generally that seemed to be a very good thing at the NFL level. So not so much a whole combination of all of these 12 different ones, but if I really keyed in on those 4, it seems like that could maybe have somewhat of an indicator of NFL success. So That's what I have highlighted in here, that if you are highlighted blue, that means that you hit on all of those and that you also had more than 3 of my markers hit, which is basically the same thing as wide receivers. If you don't hit on 3 of my markers, probably weren't even that good of a prospect anyway. So you have to have more than 3 of my markers hit and have hit on those 4 PFF metrics to get highlighted blue. So that's where Jonathan Brooks got hit. That's where Bucky Irving got highlighted. So if I had known that last year, Bucky Irving might have been a bigger target for me in later rounds of drafts just from that. Tyrone Tracy also gets highlighted from last year's class from that kind of system as well. Bijan, of course, was phenomenal. Achane got highlighted from this. Spears got highlighted from this. Zach Evans, rest in peace to Zach Evans. Algier, once again, got highlighted. I don't even know who that is. Etienne, Javonte, Michael Carter, and Ramondre Stevenson got highlighted from the 2021 class. JT, of course, DeAndre Swift was phenomenal. Antonio Gibson got highlighted. He actually had 2 top 12 seasons in his first 2 or 3 years. So, and I think he was like a mid-second or even a third-round pick in rookie drafts. So looking pretty good. So you can see overall, Tony Pollard also gets highlighted again. Rodney Anderson, Elijah Holyfield, Rashad Penny, RIP, Cook, Mixon, Hunt, and Kamara all got highlighted in that. So again, like there are misses, but if we're using that as a way of measuring who could potentially be a good bet to draft, doesn't seem all that bad. And, of course, you're going to hit and miss on some of those guys. And, of course, a lot of those guys are 3rd or 4th round picks. But using that, if you can have success on just using one singular thing, it seems to be pretty good to identify, better late round guys to try to target than just throwing a dart throw at the dartboard and hoping that you hit. And then you end up drafting somebody like, Kamani Vidal or somebody like that, or Dylan Labe or Isaiah Davis or whoever. And you instead then go after a Tyrone Tracy or a Bucky Irving or a Ramondre Stevenson or somebody like that. Seems to be better. So that is the marker system in and of itself and how I utilize them. So taking a look at the 2025 class from what we have so far, from just the production metrics and then the PFF metrics, of course, pre-combine, so we don't have any of that stuff, don't have a draft capital yet. Of course, Ashton Genty tops the list. Surprise, surprise. He is actually on pace to be the 4th perfect prospect in my database. So he has hit on all 6 of the markers that he possibly could on right now. And with the 6 remaining, if he hits on those 6, which he's going to be a first-round pick. So if he hits on the 5 combine athleticism ones, which I think he will, then he will be the 4th perfect prospect in my database. And, of course, he hits on all 11 of my PFF markers, including those very 4 specific ones that I'm looking for. So Ashton Genty, of course, phenomenal prospect. Marion Hampton comes out as my RB2. He's on pace to hit 11 of my markers, so very interesting there. And I do believe that he's going to hit on the draft capital one, as if not even a late first, as a solid 2nd round pick. So he should be good there. Travion comes in at RB4. Cam Scatterboot comes in at RB5. RJ Harvey comes in down here. Devin Neal, Ollie Gordon, that's your top 8. You will notice that Caleb Johnson and Quinshon Judkins are all the way down here, hitting on 2 and 3 markers respectively. So I think that's more of just them being 2-down backs, and not so much really like plotters, but being 2-down guys that didn't really show. They showcased some receiving ability, both having a best single season reception number of 22. Judkins, of course, had that phenomenal freshman season. Caleb Johnson didn't really do anything until his junior year. And was phenomenal with it, with his points per game. But Judkins never really had a season of phenomenal points per game, and his last points per game season got tanked because he was sharing the backfield with Travion. At least Travion at least showed the ability, early on. Of course, he's a phenomenal receiver, had that phenomenal freshman year as well. Never really hit in points per game. And, of course, his last point per game got tanked because Judkins was there. So some things you have to take with a grain of salt, and, of course, that's where the subjectiveness of analysis comes in, and we pair that with film. But it is very interesting to see where some of the top guys kind of land in my marker system very, very early on. Dylan Sampson's down in here too. Woody Marks, I know, is a late round kind of favorite guy. He's also 24 years old, so kind of a yikes. But there are some very interesting names in here for 2025, of course, highlighted by Ashton Genty. It's going to be phenomenal. So That is at least taking a look at the running back marker system and my wide receiver marker system. I currently do not have anything for quarterbacks or tight ends. Tight ends just seems like such a crapshoot just in general. You could have the draft capital, you could have the collegiate production, you could have the athleticism, but at the end of the day, none of that might matter. So I haven't really dove into tight end markers because it just seems like such a phenomenal crapshoot that there really only is like a handful of tight ends that are relevant any given year. And they have over the past like 15 years, it's been like the same like 3 or 4 guys. So it just seems like not a waste of time to do tight end markers, but I just really am not that interested in doing it. Quarterback, seems like there's so much more with the quarterback position than just production markers and PFF markers. There's a lot of, mentalness that goes into it. You have to have the intelligence to run an offense, the suave to run an offense, the arrogance, so to speak, to run an offense and be a team leader like that. So I feels like for the quarterback position, there is so much more that goes into success at that position than just production at the college level. So I haven't also dove into quarterback markers, but of the 2 positions, I will probably dive into quarterback markers before I do tight ends. So maybe I'll do a video on that, or you guys will hear about that in prospect evaluations for this year with Shador and Cam and Dart and everybody like that. But at least for running backs and wide receivers specifically, that is my eval. That is my process. I'm very sorry that this was a phenomenally long video. So if you made it through this, thank you so much. I'll be referencing back to this video a ton over the course of rookie season as well. So, just save this one, bookmark it or whatever it is, give it a thumbs up so you can always reference back to it if you need to. But this was just basically a brain dump, data dump, get this information out here in terms of how I evaluate rookies analytically at the running back and wide receiver position. That's what this video was intended to be. So thank you so much for watching and for sticking to this point. If you got this far, we'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace.